Let me say this clearly. I believe green energy is better for humanity in the long run. Cleaner air, lower long term costs, less environmental damage, more resilience. That's the direction we should be heading. But there's an uncomfortable reality right now. We don't live in that future yet. We're getting there, but not quite yet. And until we do, oil still shapes geopolitics, military posture, alliances, sanctions, and war. In other words, whether we like it or not, the spice must flow. Now let's make one more thing clear. Nobody likes Nicolas Maduro. Nobody thinks Nicolas Maduro is a good guy. Nobody thinks he should stay in power. He's accused of being a major cocaine trafficker, not fentanyl, despite what Donald Trump suggests. The International Criminal Court alleges crimes against humanity. And just so there's no confusion, I'm still talking about Maduro. Yeah, it's kind of snarky. I kind of apologize. Sorry, not sorry. So when Donald Trump says the US interest in Venezuela is about drugs, he's not exactly lying. He's just not telling the whole truth. I've heard other explanations too. Some say it's about rewarding Venezuelan voters in Florida. Others say it's about regime change so the US can deport Venezuelan migrants back home. Maybe, possibly. But the drug argument doesn't survive even mild scrutiny. If the US arrested Maduro tomorrow for cocaine trafficking, are we really supposed to believe Trump wouldn't pardon him the same way he pardoned Honduras former President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted of facilitating more than 400 tons of cocaine into the United States? This isn't about narcotics, it's about oil. Not how much oil America produces, but what kind of oil it produces, where that oil can be refined, and who controls the bottlenecks. And yes, if you live in Canada, this affects your leverage, your economy, your sovereignty, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. I'm Fear Shields, and this is North America, where we look past slogans and into systems that actually drive power. Let's get into it. Why this matters. Most people hear America produces more oil than anyone and assume the story ends there. It doesn't. Yes, the US production exploded after the shale revolution, not shell, shale, Shale. Yes, fracking rewrote the energy map. And yes, Venezuela today is only about the 21st largest producer by annual output. So why should Washington care? Because oil isn't just barrels in the ground. Oil is chemistry. Oil is infrastructure. Oil is refinery compatibility built decades ago at costs so high they lock in behavior for generations. If Canada misunderstands that, we completely misread US behavior. And if nothing changes, Canada risks becoming a permanent upstream supplier with no pricing power, no strategic leverage, and no meaningful say in how its resources shape continental security. Most exporting countries build energy systems around what they produce. The US inherited a system built for something very different. Structural context. Not all oil is the same. Crude oil comes in three broad categories: light, medium, and heavy. Light crude flows easily and can sometimes come out nearly clear. Heavy crude is thick, tar like molasses, and extremely viscous. Medium, do I have to explain medium seriously? Here's what most people miss. Refineries aren't neutral, they're purpose built machines. Once a refinery is engineered for heavy crude, you don't just flip a switch and feed it light shale. Retrofitting costs billions of dollars. Retrofitting takes years. Since the shale boom, over 70% of new US production has been light crude. But the US refining system, especially along the Gulf Coast, was built decades ago to process heavy oil. That mismatch explains almost everything that follows. Who benefits from this system? Well, refiners, of course, and downstream fuel consumers. Who absorbs the cost? Upstream producers, especially Canada. In most countries, production and refining evolve together. In the US, history froze the system in place, where American oil is actually refined. The US has more than 130 operational refineries, but capacity is concentrated. The Gulf Coast, especially Texas and Louisiana, represent nearly half of US refining capacity. These refineries were massively upgraded to process heavy sour crude. Why? Because for decades, the US imported heavy oil from Venezuela, Mexico, and Canada. California's refineries were designed around heavy local crude and Alaskan oil. Midwest refineries are tightly linked to Canadian oil sands via dedicated pipelines. Light shale oil doesn't fit neatly into these systems without blending or exporting. That's why, despite record production, roughly 40% of US light crude ends up being refined outside the US. And despite all the energy independence rhetoric, the US still imports 6 to 8 million barrels per day. 6 to 8 million barrels per day. Here's the number that changes everything. Around 70% of US crude imports are heavy oil. It's not a production failure, it's a refining reality that was built into the system. A quick note before we continue. This video isn't sponsored by a brand, it's sponsored by me. If you're short on time, feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter. A lot of you regularly leave comments like, this channel deserves much more attention. I want you to know, wow, it makes me feel so good. It is so encouraging. It really means a lot. Right now, YouTube notifications don't always seem to be going out to subscribers, and the algorithm hasn't exactly been generous to the channel. I don't know why. I just know it's happening. Maybe it's me. I'm not here to do rage bait or clickbait. I'm not trying to farm outrage. I'm just sharing how I understand geopolitics and power structures as I study them. I sometimes get it right. I sometimes don't. I'm learning in public and I'm honest about that. And thank you so much for correcting me when I am wrong. I also want to be clear about something else. I don't want to sound like a pushy YouTuber or like I'm groveling. That's really not what this is. But if you want to support the channel, the single most helpful thing you can do right now is simply share the video. It's free and it makes a massive difference. Share it with family, share it with friends, share it with colleagues or association members, share it with people in your community, your faith group, or anyone you think might appreciate a pro-Canada perspective, because we don't get that a lot. Ironically, the algorithm rewards high shares and angry comments because that's how it knows that the channel is reaching new people. Please don't send me angry comments though. Sharing is what I like. Really screwed up world we're in. If you watch regularly but haven't subscribed yet, consider doing that too. It's free. This channel reaches about 120,000 viewers every month, but only grows by about 1,500 new subscribers. That gap matters more than people realize. Again, maybe it's me. And finally, I'd love to put more time and energy into deeper research, better production, and more frequent videos. For that to be sustainable, though, the channel eventually needs to reach a basic level of income. And now the last sales pitch. If you believe this kind of fact-driven Canadian analysis should exist and grow, sharing is how that'll actually happen. Thanks for being here. Thanks for spending time with me. I really do appreciate it. Option 1, export light, import heavy. The first path the US chose was pragmatic. Export excess light crude to Europe and Asia. Import heavy crude to keep domestic refineries running. Economically, it works, makes sense. Strategically, it creates vulnerabilities though. It ties fuel prices to shipping lanes. It exposes the US to choke points, and it concentrates dependence on a small number of heavy oil suppliers. Canada benefits through volume, but Canada loses pricing power. The US gains supply security. Canada gets locked in. This path creates refinery jobs in the US while keeping Canadian value add offshore, and it leaves Canada with environmental costs and limited leverage. Option 2, rebuild US refineries. The second option is retooling refineries to handle more light crude. In theory, this increases independence. In reality, it's brutal. A major refinery retrofit costs $5 to $10 billion. Permits alone can take a decade. Local opposition is fierce. Shutdown risk is massive. And here's the part nobody's talking about. If the US succeeded at this, Canada would feel the pain immediately through lower demand and weaker pricing. The misconception is that America can just flip a switch. It can't. Billions and years. Option 3, Venezuela. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. On Earth, over 300 billion barrels. Most of it is extremely heavy crude. Exactly the type US Gulf Coast refineries were built to process. That's why Venezuela still matters, even after production collapsed. That's why sanctions target energy infrastructure. That's why tanker movement triggered attention. From a systems perspective, Venezuela solves a problem shale can't. The risk is obvious. Political instability, sanctions enforcement, and reputational costs. But geopolitics isn't about ethics, it's about constraints. It's too bad it's not about ethics. The fourth player, Russia. Okay, here's something that we don't hear very much. There are only three truly major sources of heavy crude on Earth: Canada, Venezuela, and Russia. That matters. Because once Venezuela is sanctioned and Russia is hostile, the system tightens. Heavy crude isn't interchangeable. Refineries don't care about ideology, they care about feedstock. So when Washington looks at Venezuela, it's not just looking south, it's looking at a map where one supplier is sanctioned, one supplier is an adversary, and one supplier is Canada. That's leverage, and that's why Venezuela never leaves the strategic conversation. Where Canada fits. Canada now supplies roughly 60% of all US crude imports. It's not politics, it's math. I promised there wouldn't be math, and it's complicated, but there has to be a bit of math. So here's the catch. Canada exports raw heavy crude and imports refined products at higher prices. The US captures refining margins. Canada absorbs capital and environmental costs. Three explicit consequences follow. First, Canada loses pricing leverage due to limited export routes. Second, Canada becomes structurally dependent on US refinery policy. Third, Canada's energy security becomes a US domestic issue. Norway didn't accept this model. It captured value downstream and built sovereign wealth. Canada didn't. I don't know if I think we should be building refineries, though. You don't want to be the last person that sells whips when cars are invented, you know? The big misconception. The big misconception is that energy dominance is about volume. It isn't. It's about refining. It's about bottlenecks. It's about who captures value after extraction. America doesn't care about Venezuela because it lacks oil. It yeah. It cares because its infrastructure still needs heavy crude. Canada doesn't lose relevance because it lacks resources. It loses leverage because it exports value too early. This isn't left versus right. It's upstream versus downstream. Synthesis. These options aren't mutually exclusive. The US can export light oil, import heavy oil, pressure Venezuela, isolate Russia, and rely on Canada at the same time because we're reliable. That's the system. But Canada has a choice: remain a price taker or become a value keeper. Energy policy is foreign policy, refining is sovereignty. And pretending this is only about drugs misses the entire structure underneath. Conclusion. This isn't about Trump, it isn't about Maduro, and it isn't about talking points. It's about infrastructure decisions made decades ago that still shape global power today. So here's my question for you. Should Canada accept permanent upstream status, or should it start capturing more value at home? I think I know the answer, but again, I don't think refineries are the way to go. If you value clear analysis over slogans, subscribe to North of MAGA. Thanks for spending time with me. I'm Pierre Shields. Go play outside.